For the past 5 years, I've been on a hunt. Before that, I spent 10 years in the army, and even before that, I was part of a biathlon team and enjoyed recreational hiking and camping. So you could say I've spent a lot of time away from the usual paths. I'm not someone who easily gets into trouble in the woods, as I carry weapons, bear spray, a radio, and sometimes a mobile phone when there's a chance of getting a signal. Additionally, I might have a GPS, but I always carry a compass and maps. I know the woods well, and I'm skilled at surviving in them. My hunting trips usually take me to vast areas of uninhabited land in northern Ontario. During my time out there, I've come across wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions. I've even had a close encounter with a wolverine once. Black bears don't worry me much, but moose can be dangerous, but I'm careful to keep my distance from them, or, if needed, I hunt them for food. Unless I'm badly hurt, I really have nothing to fear from animals in the woods. Humans are the apex predator after all, and it's good to be king. That being said, I am wary, but not afraid, of other men I run into in the woods, and most of the time, they're friendly and go on their way. Some are aggressive or drunk, but offering them a cigarette and kind words tends to calm those guys down. I'll share a couple of unexplained occurrences, however, that still chill me to this day. The first one happened a few years ago while I was solo hunting deer in the fall. I was camped for the night in a vast, frozen, swampy area. The only access was a decades-old logging track off the main road, and I was several kilometers from that track. There were no other hiking trails or other access, so I was sure I was quite alone. As a matter of fact, I hadn't seen or heard anyone else for 2 days. I had a good dinner and went to sleep as it started to lightly snow. I woke up with a start at 4:32 in the morning. I could clearly hear sleigh bells, the kind Santa's reindeer wear. There were no other sounds, except the wind and snow, no pre-dawn birds, footfalls or snapping twigs, just eerie bells intermittently jingling. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but I forced myself to check all my gear to prove to myself that I was awake. Then I sat there, shivering in my tent, praying that whatever was making that sound would go away. Going outside there to look wouldn't have helped, as it was pitch black anyway. My mind was running through all the logical possibilities. Like it's a dog or a cat wearing a bell on its collar. Or some hikers wearing bells. My mind started to get away from me. I finally couldn't take it any longer and I shouted out, "Whoever's ringing those damn bells can go away now." Then the bells abruptly stopped. But still I sat there, listening for another couple of hours, as my mind racing with chills aching down my spine. Thankfully, the bells never returned. When the morning came, I searched the area with my rifle, trying to find any signs of who or what had passed by during the dark night. Everything was covered in fresh snow, so it should have been easy to spot tracks, but there was nothing. I searched thoroughly for a long distance in all directions, but found no trace of anyone or anything. When I realized this, I packed up my belongings and quickly left that place. I decided that hunting there for the rest of the season wasn't a good idea. I tried to make a joke about it, saying I was scared away from the woods by Santa, but deep down, I was genuinely frightened. A few years later, I was out hunting grouse, trying to find those elusive birds hiding in the bushes. I was in a faraway place, and there were big power lines and towers cutting through it. I was walking along one of those cuts, enjoying the sunny day and whistling. I really like hunting birds in that area. It's a calm and laid-back way to spend the day compared to other types of hunting. After a while, I heard the sound of ATV engines, which wasn't surprising. I went over to the person who stopped their ATV near me. He asked if I had seen any birds, almost yelling because his engine was so loud. I introduced myself and shook his hand. He told me his name was Hansen, and he looked at me from head to toe. I laughed and told him my name. He was quite old, even older than me, and I'm getting up there in age. We had a smoke and chatted for a while. His great-grandfather had established the first hunting camp in the area back in 1839, and they still ran it every fall. He knew those woods well. We compared shotguns, talked about the beautiful weather, and the usual bullshittery. When I found out they had no younger guys in their party, I was actually hoping for an invite to his camp for deer season and was angling the conversation that way. Get some tips and stories, new blood carrying on the tradition and all. How long you been coming here? He had cut me off, suddenly and sternly. A couple of years, I said, mostly for birds. Then you heard her. Her? What the fuck was he talking about? The witch. I couldn't help but smile at that, although his face was deadpan and serious. Right away I knew he was trying to spook me off his hunting spot with the ghost stories, and just before deer season to boot. This is public property, after all. So you're telling me a witch has haunted these woods since the 19th century? I was humoring him. Yeah, something like that. He spit and put his smoke out with his boot. Used to live in that abandoned farmhouse off the access road. I had seen the place before, a creepy pioneer log cabin, disused for generations. When my young son had been with me one day, he had refused to go near the place. He had complained that it made him feel all wrong. You know she's nearby when you hear the sleigh bell. My blood froze. Well, nice meeting you, handsome. Thanks for the chat. I stammered and abruptly turned and walked back to the cut, and I could feel him staring at me the whole way. He eventually started his engine and rode away. What an asshole. How did he know that? Was this some sort of backwoods folklore about witches and sleigh bells? I walked straight to my truck and drove out of there, fast. When I got home, I Googled it for hours and nothing came up. I eventually wrote it off as a coincidence and tried to push it out of my mind. Sometime later, I was packing for my deer hunt. I had friends coming from faraway cities to join me for hunting, and I was excited about it. It was going to be fantastic not to go alone. But then, one by one, they all canceled. One said that his wife is in the hospital, but I felt it was more like she was just controlling him. Another friend said he had to work as he was a very busy doctor, which sounded more believable. The last one suddenly had to work nights. I wasn't bothered. I decided to go hunting anyway. I would take pictures of the beautiful deer I caught and tell them stories for years, teasing them about their lame excuses for canceling. So I went back to the area near the power lines, where I had seen and followed many animal trails during my bird hunting trips. Besides, I sure as shit was not going back to the frozen swamp of witch bells, as I now called it. I knew Hansen and his mates would be around, but I knew where their camp was, and I was heading to the southeast, near Little Birch Lake, deep in the woods. I had butterflies in my stomach. Pretty common for me at the beginning of a season, all giddy with excitement. But they were more intense somehow. I tried not to think of Hansen's story. Then again, if Hansen had obviously survived years of hunting in the same woods, so would I. Furthermore, the weather was nice, intermittent sun, and hovering around freezing. Overall, a nice day to go out into the woods. I wore a smile when I headed out. Now, if you've never been big game hunting in close country, in the bush, as it's known, it's rather slow going. You're wearing light boots and sneaking around, trying to make as little noise as possible. My buddy and I, we call it last of the Mohican style. Every step is measured and placed carefully, toe to heel, to reduce noise. Your head's up, scanning around, ears straining for any hint of game sounds. The English call it still hunting, or stalking. I much prefer it to sitting in a stand freezing your ass off all day. I proceeded southwest from the cut at my snail's pace. It probably took me all day to cover the 5 or 6 kilometers to the lake, but it was exhilarating. Gliding silently through the bush like an expert tracker, taking in all the sights, sounds, and smells. The weather had soured over the course of the afternoon, clouding over and getting breezy. It was getting darker and colder. The late fall forest had come alive, swaying and creaking in the breeze. The change had been so gradual I hadn't even noticed it. Then I realized I hadn't smoked all day, so I lit one to calm myself down, and it was helping. When I was about to put out the cigarette, I noticed something unusual in the woods, a hint of black color. I wondered if it could be a bear, so I got ready with my rifle and turned off the safety. I looked through the sight to see better. I started talking loudly, hoping it would scare away any potential bear, but I wasn't taking any risks. I had a full magazine of powerful 308 Akabon bullets ready if I needed them. And I was an expert shot, having been shooting since I was a kid. I was standing now, in a firing stance, and stepping towards the black smear while talking. It didn't move as it came into full view. I lowered my rifle, then let out a sigh of relief and walked over to it, chuckling out loud at my nervousness. It was the scene of a bird's demise. A turkey, by the looks of it, and fresh. There had been a struggle, and there were feathers everywhere. A fox or a coyote had a good meal, that was for certain. One of its claws was left from the drumstick up. It had been gnawed off. I saw the other leg propped up against the tree nearby, and under it was the tail fan. I went to check it out as it looks unnatural. The fan had been cleanly severed from the bird and the leg had been cut off at the joint with a knife. The evil-looking claw had clearly been propped up against the tree by someone. I tossed the claw from between my fingertips, anxious to be rid of it. My mind began racing again. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no trails. There are no witches, I mumbled as I stood up. I took a deep breath and pressed on, uncertainly. It was nearly dusk now, and the brackish small lake had come into view. The wind was gusting now, carrying with it the scent of putrid, semi-frozen water. I was still feeling rattled, but I resolved to find a spot, set up camp, build a big-ass fire, and drink the flask of brandy I had in my breast pocket, eat some food, and fall asleep. That would make everything better. I was nearing the edge of a clearing by the lake, feeling better about my situation when I heard a loud splash, sounding like something big had jumped into the water, closely followed by another one. Then nothing but the wind as ripples spread across the water. I moved closer to see where they or it had gone, and then I heard them again. Sleigh bells. I could feel the tendrils of panic tightening around my chest and temples like the first time I had been in combat. My vision narrowed. "Fuck you, Hanson, I've had enough of your shit, and you're not gonna scare me out of here." "Hello?" I shouted into the gloom. Yet I could see nothing for the trees. More bells. I'm not ashamed to admit that I fled. I shouted a curse and started back the way I came in. I grabbed at my compass, hanging from a lanyard at my shoulder. My hands were shaking as I tried to make out the luminous dial. The needle spun around at random, totally useless. I held my wrist with my other hand and tried to steady it. The bells kept ringing, and I got really nervous. While trying to escape, I grabbed my GPS and used it to find my way back to my truck. The bells seemed to be following me, and I warned them to stop. I raised my rifle, pointing it towards the lake where the sound was coming from, but it didn't make the bells go away. It was so dark that I couldn't see anything anymore. I realized that threatening with a rifle in the dark wouldn't help, so I turned around and hurried through the woods too quickly, stumbling and cursing along the way. Thankfully, the bells slowly faded and finally stopped. I kept repeating to myself, "Please, just make it to the truck," as I pushed through the dense woods. Finally, I managed to calm down enough to put on a headlamp, so I wouldn't keep stumbling. It was a real struggle to make my way through the thick bushes and plants. My shins, knees, and hands were all scratched up from the ordeal. I kept chanting to keep myself going. When I reached the truck, I thought nothing had followed me, but then I heard more bells. I can't remember much about the drive home. It was all a blur. Weeks passed, and I eventually started to feel better. I was thankful that nothing bad happened to me or that I didn't go missing, both for my own sake and for my family's sake. I decided I would never go hunting alone again. One night, while watching TV with my wife, we decided to stay at home and have a nice picnic in bed while flipping through channels. I clicked the TV remote and saw a news report. "Hey, wait," she said. "What's the matter?" as she clicked back. On the screen, a police officer was talking, as they found two missing hunters, Edward Hanson, 86 years old, and his brother Robert, 83 years old, from Lanark County. Sadly, they were found dead weeks after the search for them had stopped. The coroner said it was an accidental drowning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stood up, my hands on my head in shock. My wife asked me what was wrong, trying to comfort me, but I was in disbelief. The news said they were found on the shore of a distant Little Birch Lake, and the police didn't suspect any foul play. They weren't treating it as a murder investigation. The news asked anyone with information to come forward.
This happened 14 years ago when I was 17 years old. It happened in my childhood home. This is the most terrifying experience I have ever had with the paranormal. I always knew my house was haunted. I would see things out of the corner of my eye, hear weird noises, and just have strange things happen. I really tried to convince myself that part of it was my imagination and my own interest in the paranormal. But one February night, I would experience something that to this day makes the hair stand up on my neck. When I was 17, my parents separated. I opted to stay in the family home with my father. My father relapsed during this time and was a heavy alcoholic, so I was left alone quite a bit, especially when he was drinking, which he often was. To get a better picture of the story, I need to explain how my house was laid out. The living room was huge. The couch was placed on one wall that had a window into the kitchen. No glass, just a pass through. A cutout rectangle that let us see each other from the kitchen to the living room. To get to the kitchen, you would have to go through the office and hallway all around the house. In the back of the kitchen are the stairs to the basement and our back door that leads to the backyard. It was its own road access and we parked in the back of the house. One night I was alone. I have always been a night owl and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning when this event happened. I was sitting on my couch watching CSI and I heard my back door open and close. This is not unusual, as my uncle lived close by and the closest access was through the back lane from our backyard. My first thoughts were annoyed if my dad was coming through the back door. He was coming from my uncle's and he would probably be extremely drunk. I called out, "Dad?" No answer. Annoyed that he wasn't responding, I yelled out louder, "Dad!" Again no answer. At this point, I am totally pissed off because if he isn't responding to me, then he is really drunk, and I hated dealing with him when he was like that. I got up from the couch, turned around to look through the window to the kitchen that showed the kitchen and the back door, and opened my mouth to call him. But then I stopped as soon as I saw it. At first, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Standing in the middle of my kitchen was a 7 to 8 foot tall black silhouette. I could see this thing's head, shoulders, arms, legs, but no facial features. It was the blackest black I have ever seen, and I was terrified. I whispered Dad one last time just to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I was hoping it was a practical joke. No answer. No movement until this tall, dark shadow slowly turned its head to look at me. I quickly ran toward the desk across the living room, grabbed an envelope knife since it was the only available weapon. I walked around the corner to the porch, grabbed my boots. This was February in northern Canada after all, and silently stood there waiting to see what would happen if I stayed. At this point, I was a little bit curious, and that trumped my fear at the time. After standing for what seemed like hours, but was actually only minutes, I could hear creaking coming from the kitchen. My cat walked past me from the living room and toward the kitchen. She looked into the kitchen and all of a sudden started acting very strangely. She moved one leg at a time in a stiff motion. All of her hair was raised, and once she was out of whatever trance she was in, she bolted upstairs. At this point, I was done. I ran out the door and ran barefoot in the snow until I felt safe. I put my boots on and continued to walk to a local convenience store to call my dad. My dad was sober at his girlfriend's and agreed to come get me and bring me home to investigate. He went into the house first, inspected everything. He couldn't find anything. I then hesitantly went inside and said it came through the back door. We walked to the back door and he said, "How? It's locked." The color drained from my face, as I myself had to turn the handle and try to open the door to prove it to myself. Sure enough, it wouldn't open. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know why this entity appeared to me or what it wanted. I do know that it terrified me. I refused to sleep in the house for weeks, and to this day, discussing it makes my eyes water and my hair stand on end. Something came into my house that night, something uninvited.